Suppose I told you that America's greatest threat, not mainland China, not Russia, it's not North Korea, and it's not Iran. But suppose I tell you that America's greatest threat are Americans who profit from America's decline. Hi, everybody. This is Politics by Jake. This is the Weekend Show Part 2, weekend of June 13th. This is the June 14th show. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And let's get into it. Yesterday, I was talking to some of our Christian Zionist and Christian evangelist friends, and I suggested that our struggle, according to them, is not merely with flesh and blood, because their scriptures say this. You understand, I'm quoting from their scriptures. It's not with flesh and blood. It is not merely with individuals. It is with systems. And Paul was talking in Ephesians, and he didn't say systems and institutions and hidden assumptions, but I'm going to update that. And I'm going to say that. It is with systems. It's with individuals, but it's not merely with individuals. It is with systems. It is with institutions. It is with hidden assumptions. And it is what Paul called these principalities and powers. And that raises an important question. I mean, if these forces exist, if these systems exist, if these institutions exist, how do they express themselves in the real world? How do they actually operate? He says we're dealing with spiritual darkness in high places. That's really kind of mystical. How do they actually operate? Well, one way they operate is through leaders. They operate through presidents, and unfortunately, they operate very much, since Citizens United, through billionaires, through institutions, through people who become vehicles for larger forces. And that brings us to Donald Trump. In 2024, Donald Trump was campaigning, for president. When he talked with Christian Welker, he says he won in a landslide. But look, let me just digress here for a minute, because I watched the Christian Welker interview. That is now a week old at the time that this show is airing, okay? But I just wanted to say something. I wanted to orient you with regard to that. Trump has never won anything in a landslide. Never anything ever. Okay? This is what a landslide is. And I admit, this is the Politics by Jake definition of a landslide. I admit this. I think it's a good working definition. A landslide is 60% of the vote or more. That's a landslide. If you've done that, you've got a landslide. And Donald Trump has never gotten that. But in 2024, when he was campaigning for president, he made this remarkable statement, and I know you don't know it. I'm going to tell it to you now, and we're going to talk about it a little bit, because it really has a bearing on what I started the show with and what I said. He said this. He said, if you have a smart president, countries like China, Russia, North Korea, they don't have to be your enemies. A smart president can make them do great things. Now, I want you to think about that statement for a moment, okay? Because the question is not whether Donald Trump himself believes it. The question is, what are the larger assumptions that are embedded in it? And the question is, whose interests are those who are being served? As the Romans used to ask, and I've talked about on the show a lot, cui bono? To whose good? Who benefits? So he did say this. He was campaigning for president. He said, if you have a smart president, you don't have to be your enemies. Smart president will make them do great. And he was referring to what I call the axis of evil: China, mainland China, not Taiwan, North Korea, Russia, and Iran. What I call the modern axis of evil. And this is the politics by Jake speculation, but I do this for a living. I think about it a lot. I've studied and I've had experience with this. I actually grew up in New York with Donald Trump. We didn't know each other at all, but we shared the same geographic space for a significant period of time. And I truly believe, and this is the politics by Jake take on this, I believe that Trump is in office to wreck America as a democratic superpower and to allow autocracies to prosper. And I think he's also in office to get money and deals from these autocracies. And so is his family. They're all involved with that. So, for example, Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, funded by the Saudis, okay? We don't really know because there's no transparency. Things are not being revealed to us, which should be an outrage. But the corporate, conflicted, complicit, corrupt, the 4 C's or 5 C's that I always talk about when I talk about the press, they're complicit. They're corrupt. They're not pressing it. They're not talking about it. And of course, you had the aforementioned Kristen Welker interview with Meet the Press, and Trump just always pivots on this stuff, and he always attacks. And his common, and you saw, if you watched that interview, and I'm not going to talk about it very much. I could talk about it, but if you saw that interview, it's just very much the wounded leader, collective psychosis, Carl Jung, Eric Fromm concept. Everything was so unfair. I've been treated so unfairly. You know, I think maybe I'm going to read some of this to you. Hold on just a minute. So Kristen Welker starts with, why Trump are you trying to give money to your hooligan followers from, and I'm paraphrasing, a little bit, from January 6, 2020, who attacked the Congress and who vandalized the building, who beat cops. And apparently, no cop died on the scene, but there were cops on the scene who were handled very roughly and who died or committed suicide within 12 to 24 hours after that. So we can say there's a cop killer factor here, but the cop beater is, I think, beyond any doubt. So Trump says, she asked him, why should these people get money? And Trump says, because they were mistreated. And she says, well, 172 people, I'm sorry, I talked to my production staff about this. I said we decided I wasn't going to do this. I have to do this. I'm sorry. They were mistreated. It's so unfair. They've been treated so unfairly. Remember what I said at the beginning? This is what he always says. So Kristen Welker says, 172 people pled guilty to assaulting police officers. And then Trump says, you know why they pled guilty? Because they were told they were going to jail for 15 years if they faced the trial. They pled guilty because they were frightened. They went down. They were ushered into a building. This thing that obviously 1 or 2 cops on the west side of the building were so afraid by the mob was confronting them that they were not going to start fisticuffs or start shooting because, they were, terrified out of their mind. And Trump then says they were invited into the building. Many of them were arrested without even going into the building. I don't know how you know that. She says, would you be okay with these people receiving taxpayer dollars? So hooligans and cop beaters get taxpayer dollars. Follow me on this, where I'm going with this. Trump says the people were destroyed by dirty cops and by weaponization. Many of those people should be compensated. Now, with that being said, as I understand it, the weaponization fund was going to set up a group of people. As you understand it, you ordered it, people that could be picked up by anybody, fair people, smart people, and they will go on an individual case-by-case basis, right? So, okay, Trump continues. I don't know what's going to happen with the weaponization fund. Remember, the weaponization, I'm reading here, the weaponization fund also contains this other part, not just money to hooligans and cop beaters, but immunity for the Trump world, so to speak. No IRS probes, no IRS audits, none of that, which, is what he wanted. This is what he wanted. So he says he doesn't know. He doesn't know what's going to happen to the weaponization fund. He says, I love the idea because people like you, the fake, dirty press, the crooked press, people like stupid Biden, he's not smart enough to know what's going on. But people that surrounded his beautiful, resolute desk in the White House, what they did to the lives of the people, that means the hooligans, they destroyed the people. They sent people to jail who did nothing wrong. And she says, well, that was a seditious riot. And I'm sorry. And she says, there's no evidence for what you're saying. Let me ask you, and then she goes on, let me ask you about Todd Blanche. I wasn't going to do any of this. I feel like I have to do it. She's never going to get an answer about about Todd Blanche. Trump says there's a lot of evidence. Listen, there's tremendous evidence. There's nothing but evidence. He says this. Well, it's never been presented in a court of law. In other words, you never had the guts to say it under oath because that would be penalty of perjury. So Trump continues, the election was rigged. It was a dirty election. Remember, in Trump world, there are two kinds of elections, okay? There's elections that he loses. The elections that he loses, those are the rigged elections, okay? And the only other alternative is a landslide. And a landslide is when he wins. And there's no such thing with Trump as a narrow victory. Or you got through by the skin of your teeth or something like that. It's only, I won in a landslide. Well, like I said, a landslide in my book, 60% or more of yours. And by that measure, he never came close to a landslide. Never gotten a landslide. So she goes on to talk about, he wants to talk about California. The election was rigged. It was a dirty election. It's happening again in California. She keeps saying, where's the evidence? You're saying that, but where's the evidence? Where's the evidence for that? And then he switches completely. He says in California, no, they're not. They're not doing, Republicans are not doing well. They're dropping fast because it's a rigged election. See, everything is so unfair. He says this all the time. This is the wounded leader. I'm saying this and I'm taking time to go through this, which I wasn't going to do, but I'm going to do it anyway because I want you to see what he says because he says it all the time. And this is a good example. Let me tell you, it's 4 days and they aren't even close to coming up with... And she interrupts. She says, well, that's how they do it in California. And then she keeps asking. He says they're cheating. She says, where's the evidence? He says, all I have to do is look. All I have to do is look. And she said, that's not evidence. And I speak to people and let's see what's happened. That's not evidence. Do you think it's appropriate that they have an election and 5 days later, this is Trump talking, they're nowhere close to picking the winner? State and local officials acknowledge they're slow, she says. Trump is now red-faced. He's mad because nobody talks to him like this. Nobody talks to him like this. I would say he's practically, when I was looking at it, I would say he's practically snarling at this point. They're crooked, just like this is now Trump to her. They're crooked, just like you're crooked. Your press is crooked. Meet the Press is crooked. You're crooked. It's almost like some Mel Brooks comedy or something like that. Your press is crooked. Everybody's crooked. They're crooked. I'm the only one who's not crooked. And I'm laughing because it's so stupid. But I'm saying it and I'm talking about it to point out to you how he talks and where this whole idea of the collective psychosis comes from that I talk about with the wounded leader and the wounded followers, and we're going to be talking about them pretty soon too. And we've talked about them on the show. And she says, Mr. President, to be fair, and this is happening in the heat of the moment. I'm slowing it down a little bit, but she says, I'm not crooked. And his response, he says, well, if you're not crooked, you're playing right into their hands then. And she says, let's continue. And Trump says, you're either crooked or you're stupid. Is this presidential decorum? Is this what you're supposed to do? Trump continued. Imagine Joe Biden doing this in an interview. Trump continues, you play right into their hands with this stuff. You know that these elections are rigged. Your network knows that they're rigged. Do you know that I won an election in a landslide? Well, I sure don't know. Again, that never happened. And he says, I got 94% bad press. See, it's so unfair. Everything is so unfair. I'm treated so unfairly. And then he says, why? Do you know why I got all those votes? And she says, you never presented any evidence that it was rigged. Let's keep talking about it. I want to talk about Todd Blanche. She's never going to get to it. Trump, after some back and forth, says, we're living in a third world country. He's the president of the United States. He's condemning the United States as a third world country. This is just unbelievable. I mean, like I say, this is like a Mel Brooks comedy. But unfortunately, it's happening. And like I said, I've said this several times, I wasn't going to talk about any of this, but you guys need to hear this. So she says, but sir, your elections are crooked and you're crooked and meet the press is, I'm sorry, he says that your elections are crooked and you're crooked and meet the press crooked. Everybody's crooked except for Donald Trump. 34-time white-collar criminal, felon, adjudicated rapist, but everyone else is crooked. Donald Trump is not crooked. But Mr. President, and so is ABC. She's interjecting here. She's trying to interject. And she says, but Mr. President, and he goes, and so is ABC, and so is CBS, and so is CNN. And she goes, Mr. President, and he interjects and he says, you're a one-sided crooked network. And then he says, sorry, let's call it quits. I've had enough. And he complains, I travel all the way to Wisconsin. I sat in the rain for you for 1 hour, on and off in the rain. All right, okay. You ought to straighten out your press. You know what, Donald Trump? A company can never be great with a dishonest printer. All right, so that's basically that was that. That's what that was. But I wasn't gonna, like I said, I said this like 20 times. I said this more than the bit took that I did to do it. You need to hear this. This is the wounded leader talking. This is exactly the wounded leader talking, who feels that everything is so unfair and that he's been so badly treated. This is the underlayment of what goes on in Donald Trump's diseased mind, and it is a diseased mind. He has dementia. His frontotemporal lobes are literally shrinking in the brain pan. And it's a degenerative disease. He's never going to get better. He's just going to keep getting worse. And this is the guy who has the nuclear codes. This is the guy who has his finger, on the nuclear trigger. How do you feel about that? It's good, huh? So, all right. So, at this point, this is probably a good time to take a break. Let's take a break the stations, get a commercial in for Twain Consulting, and then we'll be back. And this is Politics by Jay. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting. Let's be blunt, shall we? America is litigious. It's unstable, and it's financially weaponized. If your name is on everything you own, you're a sitting duck. At Twain Consulting, we help you vanish legally, ethically, and permanently. From land trusts to layered LLCs, we teach you how to restructure your assets so the predators can't see them and can't touch them. This isn't a loophole. It's a strategy that the wealthy have used for decades. Isn't it time you got the same protection? Call Twain Consulting at 805-380-5699 or visit us online. Protect what's yours before someone else claims it. Okay, so when we left off, we were talking about his family is involved. He's enriching his family. He's trying to get the IRS so that they won't give him any audits. And there's a clip of the guy from the IRS who's handpicked by him in there saying, "You ought to thank President Trump and everything." And it's an embarrassment. It's this collection of kakistocratic toadies, the most incompetent people who are terrified of Trump, who have been told that they are to put on this show. Just like Pam Bondi talked to Bob Massey, called him a failed politician, had Trump derangement syndrome. This guy did this too. Department of Agriculture, she did this too. And so this is what we're dealing with. We've got a white collar criminal, and we've got a rapist in office, and it's been adjudicated. This is something that has been adjudicated, and he's so mad and he's so deranged that he's suing. He's doing a federal indictment against E. Jean Carroll, who is the one that he raped. So, all right, let's get back to what we were talking about before I decided to digress there. Jared Kushner is funded by the Saudis, and we don't really know because the absence of transparency that I talked about, how the corrupt, corporate, complicit media is going along with, which requires that people like me in Politics by Jake are here to kind of pick up the slack. We don't know how much money the Chinese are funneling to him through crypto, for example, which is, I wouldn't quit my day job for crypto. But at the end of his last term, he said that the Chinese had paid him $5 million for services. And I saw that, and I was at the time, and I was waiting for one of the journalists to ask him, what were the services that you provided? And we never heard. But let's go ahead and look at something that's related to this. And I've already talked about this ridiculous interview, this Meet the Press interview. But this is kind of a funny thing. It's a humorous thing. And I hope you will enjoy this part of the show where we talk about this. Remember the old Three Stooges? And I'm not even sure it was the Three Stooges that did it, and I'll explain that in a minute. But they did a bit, and I don't know if it has a title, but if I were to give it a title, I would call it the Niagara Falls bit. And it probably goes back further than the Stooges. I suspect it goes back to as far as 19th century vaudeville. When Niagara Falls was electrified, it was one of the most progressive cities in the United States at that time. And the bit is about a guy who gets cheated on. His wife leaves him, and he's after the guy who did it, and he catches up with him at Niagara Falls. And maybe you remember, Abbott and Costello did the bit too, but they didn't make it up. And the Three Stooges, I don't think they made it up either. I think they culled it from something that came before. Very early 20th century, like the Audis or the teens maybe. And I think going back into the late 19th century. So he catches up with the guy who did it at Niagara Falls. And maybe you have heard the lines. Slowly I turned, step by step, inch by inch, and it goes on from there. It's very funny because he's talking to a person who has accidentally said a catchphrase. And he's snapped. This guy is very calm. He's very normal up until that point. He's talking very genially with this guy. And then he says Niagara Falls. And he says, Niagara Falls. And he snaps. And he begins to attack the guy because he's going to show him what he did to the guy who stole his wife from him. And it goes on from there. It's very funny. And I would say for me, instead of Niagara Falls, the catchphrase would be anticipatory repudiation, exclamation point. That's me. That's the legal trade. Then anyway, slowly I turned, step by step. You can look at this on the internet, inch by inch, etc. He's a little bit older than the Three Stooges. Like I said, it goes back to vaudeville, it goes back to burlesque, and the bit that most people remember is done by the Three Stooges. It was also done by Abbott and Costello, and the trigger phrase was Niagara Falls. Slowly I turned, step by step, inch by inch, and everybody in the audience. See, it's a comedy bit. Everybody in the audience, because they all knew it. And everybody in the audience knew when they said Niagara Falls, they knew what was coming and they began to laugh. I mean, it was a winner. And the beauty of the gag is that the phrase itself becomes a psychological trigger. The poor guy who's just normal and talking normally to this other guy who's unsuspecting, has no idea of what he's stumbled into, what he's blundered into. The guy hears Niagara Falls and he instantly loses all self-control because of the old grievance that is attached to it. And as I recall, the humor, the absolute humor of the gag is that when the bit starts, as I said, he presents himself just as a normal, calm, literate person. But when he hears the word Niagara Falls, he just completely changes. And he becomes, criminally insane. It's a very, very funny bit. Very funny. That's the heart of the joke. The audience is being introduced to a perfectly normal human being. This was a popular bit in the day. And so everybody knew that it was coming, and it was just it was a winner. Polite. The guy was polite, was reasonable, he was articulate, he was civilized. And then somebody says Niagara Falls. And suddenly the mask drops. Not gradually, but instantly. Just like that. And the transformation is the joke. See? 1 second he's, why, yes, good sir, I quite agree. And then, Niagara Falls. Slowly I turned, step by step, inch by inch, and he begins to beat him over. This unsuspecting guy beats him over the head, starts to strangle him, punches him in the nose. It's a very, very funny bit. And the audience knows what's coming, which, like I said, actually makes it funnier. The anticipation is part of the gag. And the thing that I would point out is that, and I'm going somewhere with this, for the modern day, or the relatively modern day, is that this is really not a joke about Niagara Falls. And it never was a joke about Niagara Falls. But it's a joke about something that people realized back in the 19th century, at least as far back as the 19th century. It's a joke about psychological triggers. And the phrase has become so associated with an old grievance that it bypasses reason entirely. The civilized man disappears, and the obsession takes over. It happens like that. And what's also funny about the original gag is that it's showing you how thin the veneer of civilization can be. The character presents himself as rational, controlled, educated, calm, genial, affable, gregarious. This is all the setup for the gag, you see. Completely normal, literate person, calm, no frenzy at all. Then one phrase reveals that underneath he's carrying this enormous emotional charge. And frankly, that's why the bit has survived for over a century, because everybody has a Niagara Falls, a phrase, a memory, a movie quote, a song. I mean, I have several. There's this great one of my great lines, that movie lines that I like is at the end of Chinatown, where the Jack Nicholson character, whose name is Jake Gittes, he's being taken away, and his associate takes him away and says, "Forget it, Jake," because he wants to punch the cop who used to be his partner. And he says, "Forget it, Jake. It's Chinatown," and that sums everything up. Starred great actors, like I said, Jake Gittes, played by Jack Nicholson. Play It. This is Bogart's nod in Casablanca, when the Paul Henreid character, when the Germans are singing De Wacht am Rhein, which is a German song exalting the fatherland, and they're singing it loudly, and they're in Casablanca. And this freedom fighter, who is played by Paul Henreid, he walks up, he strides up to the band, because Bogart is playing a tavern owner, and there's a band there. And he strides up to them and he says, the Marseillaise, which is the French national anthem. Play it. And the trumpet player, who I guess is the leader, looks at Bogart, and Bogart nods. And then this takes off of this powerful scene, and it just bypasses all reason. And this is one of the reasons why people insist that Casablanca is one of the greatest movies of the 20th century. You're probably right. But it's because of things like that. This is what I'm trying to point out. I mean, and if you think I'm puffing, or if you think I'm exaggerating, go watch it. Watch the movie before you go watch the movie to understand where history was at the time of the movie. And you will become a follower. I'll give you dollars to donuts. I'll give you dollars to donuts. You will become a follower of that movie. And you will do those things and look at it honestly. You'll realize that Jake was not just talking through his hat. There's a scriptural phrase for those of you who are so inclined: charity never faileth. There's a great song by Carly Simon, who, interestingly, Carly Simon, she always had stage fright. I didn't know that. But she sang this wonderful song. The lines are famously, I know nothing stays the same, but if you're willing to play the game, it's coming around again. Each one of these phrases carries a whole world behind it. And the phrase is just the handle. The emotions, the memories, and the stories, they are all the luggage that is attached to it. And the old vaudeville comedians understood something about this, and it was profound what they understood. The funniest thing in the world is a perfectly rational man suddenly revealing, at the drop of a hat, as it were, that he is not nearly as rational as he thought he was. This thin veneer of civilization, and I personally fear this, that the veneer of civilization is thin, and that it would go away very quickly. And I think that's why the guy who is interviewing the entirely normal man, we could talk about this on the show. Remember this guy? I played the clip on the last show. Or go to YouTube, Politics by Jake. It's also on Rumble, and I've got the clip. And I played the clip in the last show, this is entirely. I described him as not only normal, but calm, and he's an older man. Calm, reflective, introspective, unprepossessing. He's not putting on any airs or anything like that. Just rational, older man. And the person interviewing him is having a conversation with him. And it's just, it goes completely Niagara Falls. And when I say that, I mean he's completely normal up to a certain point. And all of a sudden, the interviewer talks about Donald Trump. And he talks about Donald Trump being the hand of God, which is, just an absurdity. And it's an intellectual on every level. It's an insanity. I have labeled Donald Trump, I did it on the show, by the way, as a destroyer. And it's not something I back off from. I said years ago, I've been saying it since 2016, that he's going to destroy everything. And he is. And it's proceeding apace. He's trying to destroy everything. That's why he's in office. Remember, I started the show with that? That's why he's in office. He's in here to destroy the old order with MAGA Mike Johnson, who wants to wipe out spending on the people, wants to wipe out Medicare, wants to wipe out Social Security, wants to wipe out Medicaid. And why does he want to do these things? Because there's an enormous pot of money. Remember the privatization of the Postal Service that I talk about occasionally on the show? Why do they want to privatize it? Well, they say, well, it's free enterprise. It's not fair. See, there you go again. It's not fair. We should have we should be able to compete. Well, look, there's always been a public sector in the United States. Some things are necessary for the governmental infrastructure of the United States. There are some things that should be nationalized. Boeing, for example, should be nationalized. There are certain other things that should be nationalized. I don't have it. I can't speak at the top of my head. But there has always been a public sector. But why is that? Because there's money there. Because people want the pot of money. And they see that pot of money and they want it for themselves. Remember when I used to talk about Donald Trump? Last show. And on the stage, he said, all I knew is that from the first I can remember, I had to get, and he did this with these motions. I had to get all I can. He looked up to the sky. I had to get all I could get. He's not the only one. And you don't need to overthink this. And this is one of the things that, I'm talking about. What do we see? We see so many examples of his insanity, so many examples of his malignant narcissism. And the latest one, of course, is the blockade. And you may well say the blockade of the Iranian ports, which is like a counter blockade. The Iranians have blockaded the Straits of Hormuz. And so the United States, and it's a legitimate military maneuver on its face, is the blockade of the Iranian ports. So the Iranians can't pump any oil because there's no place to put it. And let me explain the rest of this to you. It's a legitimate military maneuver, but with oil, it can't go in the ships. They only have so much storage. There's only a finite number of ships, and they're basically sitting in the harbor. They can't move because of the American blockade. And the thing that you have to understand about oil, if it would be good, might be good for us to have someone on the show who knows oil. But once you start an oil well, you have to keep it going. And if you don't, a concept called entropy kicks in. So then, in other words, if you don't keep the oil flowing in these wells, and if you stop the flow right now, an entropic effect kicks in. And it may not be possible to get the wells going again. And if you think the price of oil is high now, wait till you see something like that happen. And it's not possible to get any oil for much of the world except the United States. The United States has been a net exporter of oil for a long time. In fact, some people have talked about the fact that there's so much oil that has no value really, except the value that is created in the minds of people who will purchase it. Someone likened oil at one time to like selling a pail of water. It was so common. But the idea is just that the impact it will have is completely destabilizing, completely destructive thing. Because our economies require a steady flow of oil, right? You can talk about the fact that, and I think it's perfectly acceptable to do so, by the way, we need renewable resources. We do need them. We need other forms of energy. I say absolutely. But where I step off is with people who talk about they're refusing to consider nuclear as one of those sources. And as far as my research goes, nuclear energy is the only thing among all of these other proposals for renewable energy. It's the only thing that will consistently carry a net load. Wind won't do it. Water won't do it. And at this point, I've talked a little bit. Let's take another break, and we'll break the station, have a commercial, and then we'll be back. And this is Politics by... Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting. Imagine, if you will, having the power to disappear from the prying eyes of creditors, identity thieves, nosy strangers, all while protecting what you've worked so hard to build. That's what virtual invisibility offers. It's not magic. It's smart legal and business strategy to shield your assets and privacy so you can live free, confident, and in control. Most people think that asset protection is only for the ultra-wealthy, but it's for anyone who wants peace of mind and financial security, including you. Don't wait until it's too late. Take control now. Call me at 213-465-0639 or go to facebook.com/Twain Consulting to learn how virtual invisibility can protect you and your family, because when you're invisible to risk, you're unstoppable. All right, this is Politics by Jake. We're back for the third and what will probably be the final segment. Anyway, nuclear energy, as I was talking, it's the only thing that will carry a net load. And of course, what that means is that it produces usable energy besides what the energy is that it takes to, actually generate it and produce the reaction that causes the production of energy in the first place. Wind won't do that. Water won't do that. They can produce energy, to a certain extent, but not to the extent of nuclear energy. And if you're going to talk about renewable energy or alternative forms of energy and you don't talk about nuclear, you're dead in the water. And the people who talk about renewable and reusable energy refuse to consider nuclear energy. I think that's just a big mistake, Anyway, getting back to what we were talking about when I digress and any compounds, you'll notice we were going over the clip. Not as only does he talk about Donald Trump being a prophet or the hand of God, or he's a messenger sent by God, or he's chosen by God, or just, whatever it is. But he does say that, and I think this is interesting. And it is characteristic of MAGA, at least many of them, but he goes further. And he conflates this, and he talks about the Reverend Sun Myung Moon. And he said the Reverend Moon, as if the Reverend Moon, has a direct link with God. And he just pulled that out of his hat. He just pulled that out of the air, And I think I commented to you at the time that we may as well talk about Ike. Remember Reverend Ike? Reverend Ike, I prefer Reverend Ike. I like him because he wanted me to have that Cadillac. I always kind of like that about Reverend Ike. But it's just absurd. It's completely absurd. But there you have a completely normal person. And I encourage you to go back to the show and look at the clip. It's up on YouTube. It's up on Rumble. Also on Facebook or Instagram if you have it at Politics by Jake. Or you can even go to the internet and pull it up there. Pull it up on YouTube. You don't need to just rely on my show. You have a completely normal person. And then you start talking about Donald Trump being the hand of God, and it's the old Niagara Falls bit. It really is the old Niagara Falls bit. And I hasten to add that I'm not casting aspersions upon those who believe in Reverend Moon, any more than I'm casting aspersions on people who believe Reverend Ike, who, I said I particularly like, because he wants me to have the Cadillac. That's what he said. God wants you to have that Cadillac. And that's not the point. It's the departure from normalcy, if an otherwise completely normal acting and looking person, that's what leads you to the inevitable conclusion that normalcy is just a thin veneer. And, that if this is the case, maybe what we need to do is we need to take another look at what we consider, number one, what we consider civilization, and number two, what we consider to be normal. Now, there was a Russian-born American author, I believe it's Isaac Asimov, and based on his body work, he's generally considered one of the most prolific writers of all time. And he coined this quote. He said this. He said, "There is a cult of ignorance in the United States, and there always has been. This strain of anti-intellectualism has been a constant thread, widening its way through our political and cultural life, nurtured by the false notion that democracy means my ignorance is as good as your facts." The concept of democracy itself has hereby been co-opted because, everybody gets a vote, so everybody's voice matters. And my voice, whether it comes from a place of ignorance or not, should be just as worthy of yours that comes from a place of knowledge. It's how we got the depth of expertise, of science, of observable facts, of productive debate. If what I read on the internet should have the same weight as your degree and the same subject, then, where do we go from here? I mean, look, this is how we got anti-vaxxers. One of the most problematic and absurd tenets. It's just way out there, as my quantitative analysis professor used to say in college, on the tail end of the bell curve, so to speak. It's just way out there in left field, to use a baseball expression. Smallpox eradicated. 300 million lives saved. Why? Vaccinations. And many other diseases. And it's how we got the resurgence of smallpox. Smallpox was wiped out, like I said. Now it's making a resurgence. Clearly, this standard of anti-intellectualism is not working. And I think we're identifying something that the comedians and the psychologists and the storytellers have all noticed. The Niagara Falls gag isn't really about irrationality. It's about the moment when you discover what appears to be a calm, ordinary person that has a hidden organizing belief or a hidden emotional trigger. And the audience is thinking, this guy seems like a reasonable fellow. And then one phrase is mentioned, and suddenly, oh, so that's what's driving this guy. Now, where I'd be careful is in distinguishing between, I strongly disagree with this belief and this belief, because I want to be honest. I want to be intellectually honest here. And this belief is psychologically functioning as a trigger. Those aren't necessarily the same thing. I think the ability to distinguish that is the most important thing to what we're talking about here. And what I think I'm saying is that when the interview starts talking of Trump as the hand of God and Reverend Moon and, special divine missions, you stop hearing a political analysis and you start hearing something more like Niagara Falls. We've hit Niagara Falls, meaning we've arrived at a foundational assumption that is not being questioned. And people all get it, by the way. The reason why the Three Stooges were doing this bit in the 1930s and why Abbott and Costello did it in the 40s and the 50s is because it's so classic. It's so true to life. Because, as I said, this doesn't go back to them. It goes back much further than them. It goes back to 19th century vaudeville. So, anyway, once that assumption is accepted, a lot of other conclusions follow naturally. Like if this leader is divinely chosen, then ordinary political criticism becomes, difficult. If, quote, this religious figure has unique access to the truth, Donald Trump, hand of God, divinely chosen, and then contrary evidence, it gets interpreted differently. And that's not unique to any one ideology, religion, or movement. Human beings do this all the time. And that's why I like to tell the Reverend Ike joke, because I think it's funny. Because what I'm trying to do is puncture the aura. What I'm basically saying is, if we're going to start accepting self-proclaimed spiritual authorities at face value, why stop there? I mean, you see, it's this profundity of perilous political and civilizational thought. Wow, I said alliteration there. Profundity, perilous, political. I broke it at the chain at civilizational. This profundity of perilous political and civilizational thought. Holy smokes. Holy alliteration, Batman. It's civilizational thought uncovered in what really is, it's a classic comic move. That's at least what I would say. About 2 centuries removed, back in the 2020s now. I'm alleging this goes back to what I would say about 1890s. So let's say 150, 175 years anyway, or something like that. So if you want to round it up, 2 centuries, I'll do that. Yeah, it's been around. It's been around a long time, and it's been recognized a long time. And maybe we need to have recourse to the old things in order to explain these things, which are so cute. In other words, maybe we ought to look back at our forebears to explain these things that are so curious and so confounding, and for which we seem to have no explanation. And individuals who embody these perilous and malignant and dangerous traits seem unstoppable. Donald Trump himself seems unstoppable. He shouldn't be. He's a failed businessman. He's failed at business 7 or 8 times. Trump University, Trump Steaks, Trump Vodka, Trump this, Trump that. He almost blew $413 million that he inherited from his father. 34-time felon, falsifying business records. He's a crook. He's not a businessman unless you equate businessman with crook. He's a crook. He's a criminal. And yet he continues to prosper. Take a proposition, extend it one step further, than its supporters are comfortable with. What's interesting is on this, if I do say so myself, is that this connects back to something I've been discussing all through the show here, the difference between principle, institution, I talk about those things, and personality. And what I've been trying to do is to, by various ways and means, repeatedly shown skepticism towards the idea that any particular institution or leader automatically possesses special authority. And my instinct, and this, of course, is because of my legal training and my long legal and business experience, is usually this. The old lawyer, show me the evidence. Like Kristen Welker, show me the evidence. Or what happens in practice. That's the businessman. That's what I am. That's the advisor. That's the old lawyer. I want to see operational reality. So did Kristen Welker. She didn't get it, but I think it was entirely reasonable that she should ask for it. And we're going to keep talking about this. We're going to hone in on this and focus on it because it needs to be identified. And I feel I need to identify it adequately for the listening audience so that I can talk about this, because this is the fight we're in. This is 2026. This is absolutely, positively an existential election. for the United States of America as to how it goes forward after November. And I myself am not satisfied that I have focused in on it a way that I can continue to talk about it, except at length, as I'm doing here. I'd like to encapsulate it. I'd like to shrink it down into something that you can understand. That's why I talked about Niagara Falls. And we're doing this, and in the meantime, I think one potential candidate for a catchphrase, if that could explain the whole panoply of conduct that we're talking about here, the court behavior of the kakistocratic claque of idiots that is surrounding Donald Trump, MAGA, the religiously oriented, like the Christian Zionists and the Christian evangelicals. And I don't exclude those who follow Sun Myung Moon there. I think we could call it the Niagara Falls theory of belief. The moment when a seemingly ordinary conversation reveals the hidden premise underneath, not just in politics, everywhere, religion, business, relationships, conspiracy theories, financial scams, even my old managing attorney, I won't give his name, his Nigerian prince example. The hidden premise gets revealed, and that was a scam, as you remember. The Nigerian prince who's trying to get guys to pay him X amount of money to unlock $500,000 that was in a secret account, and that he just needed a little help, and then he'd share it with you. That's the Nigerian prince scam. The hidden premise gets revealed, and then the rest of the structure makes sense. The trick, of course, is that everybody thinks other people have a Niagara Falls. The harder question is, what's mine? And this is Politics by Jay.